For those of you who are coming in late, is the coffee beginning to break up? Yeah. Okay, so I can feel safe that we won't have an influx of people with no seats. All right, then let's go ahead and get started. I am Tegan Blaine. I am the director of the Climate, Environment, and Conflict Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and will be chairing today's session. The U.S. Institute of Peace has recently begun consolidating its work on transboundary water issues and beginning to fund new pieces to help us better work on transboundary water issues in the peacebuilding context. All of the presenters today are either working with USIP on new pieces of research that we hope will guide our implementation in the field, or are actually with the U.S. Institute of Peace. And so we're really looking forward to your feedback today about how this work could be applied in different contexts, and really getting your feedback about whether some of this work could actually shape what you do on water in new and interesting ways. So we really look forward to the discussion later. I've asked each of the speakers to speak for about 7 or 8 minutes. And so unless there are clarifying questions, we'll hold the questions and comments until the end. And we should have plenty of time for questions and comments. Sound okay? Then let me go ahead and introduce the speakers today. We do have one online speaker. That's Marko Keskinen. Did I pronounce that right? I'm so sorry. I hadn't had a chance to check the pronunciation with you. He's an associate professor on water resources management and policy at Aalto University in Finland. His research interests include water diplomacy, sustainability transformation, and knowledge co-production. He has over 20 years of experience working on transboundary water issues in a variety of different regions. Bota Sharipova, here in the pink and white, is working on her PhD these days in water cooperation, conflict, and diplomacy at the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education here in the Netherlands, where she's studying the role of trust in transboundary water cooperation, and we'll be talking about that today. She has hands-on experience in addressing transboundary water-related issues in Central Asia, where she worked for more than 6 years at the International Fund for Saving the Aral Sea and was a consultant for various international organizations. Melissa McCracken, there we go, is an assistant professor of international environmental policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University in Boston, the United States. She directs the Shared Waters Lab and is an affiliate with the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy and the Center for International Law and Governance at Fletcher. Her research focuses on international water governance, cooperation, and conflict over shared both surface water and groundwater issues. And Alexandra Turgul. Do you prefer Alex or Alexandra? It's fine. Alex. Okay. She is also a PhD candidate in the geography program at Oregon State University, where she manages the Transboundary Freshwater Diplomacy Database. Her research takes a multi-scalar approach to the study of conflict and cooperation in international river basins, with a particular focus on how power shapes these outcomes. She's also interested in using water as a tool to promote peace and in water conflict transformation. And then lastly, Jill Baggerman, we are squeezing you behind the screen. I'm so sorry. She is a colleague of mine. I'm afraid that Alex is in the danger zone in terms of being hit by the door, but so Jill Baggerman is a colleague of mine at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she's a program officer. She recently transitioned from our learning, evaluation, and research team to the Asia Center, where she's leading the Afghanistan and Central Asia teams, M&E work and water-related efforts.
Not M&E work anymore.
Oh, really? Okay, great. That's new in the last couple of weeks. She's focused on the intersection of peace, water, and inclusiveness. She's also worked in quite a few of the USIP countries and others in different parts of the world. She's led numerous monitoring and evaluation projects, as well as implementation of in-country reconciliation efforts. And her experience in transboundary water includes research, policy analysis, and water quality monitoring. So we're pleased to have a very strong group of speakers. We're going to start with Marko, and then we'll go in the order in which I introduce them. So Marko, all yours.
Thanks a lot, Tegan, and good morning and afternoon, everyone from sunny Helsinki, Finland. My apologies for not being able to be there in person. Tegan, you can change the slides, I guess. Yeah. So I'm going to start the session talking about trust and its role in water diplomacy and shared waters, and building on a recent study we published together with Elina, Juha, and Bota, who is there next to me. So we have a bit of a kind of a pair presentation, I guess, with Bota. But before that, next slide, please. I promised to Tegan a little bit to talk about what we mean about transboundary water peace building, which is the theme of this session, or which was included in the session titles. On the left-hand side, you can see the transboundary water cooperation, which is perhaps the traditional, kind of often quite strongly institutionalized aspect of cooperating in shared waters shared by 2 or more countries. You have joint agreements on bilateral, multilateral level. You have even UN conventions on those, and you have joint organizations, just as Rio Basin organizations, that then make the actual cooperation quite technically focused on related to data sharing, joint planning, and so forth. Obviously requiring political support, but nevertheless quite formal and established. On the right-hand side, you have the peace-building aspects and related diplomacy aspects that takes variety of forms in both formal and informal settings and across diplomacy tracks, and is typically much more politically focused and obviously considers also tensions and kind of political disagreements. Then in the middle of it, we see water diplomacy. That is one of the terms we are using, and then related to that, this transboundary water peace building concept, which kind of I see link closely together, and it's present kind of an emerging field that tries to combine the practices from the transboundary water cooperation and then from the peace building activities, with emphasis on both preventive actions and also on conflict resolution when and if there are those. And this is also approach, for example, that Finland is taking. We have at our Foreign Ministry a Peace Mediation Center that has water diplomacy and shared waters as one of its key themes. And as it happens at this very moment, there is a parallel session on this Finnish approach on transboundary waters and water diplomacy. Okay, next slide. What I'm going to tell you about, and also Bota's following presentation, is about trust that has been recognized particularly important, of course, in all interactions, but particularly when there are tensions between the parties. And yet it is not really studied much in the sphere of transboundary water cooperation and water diplomacy. Hence, next slide, please. And you can click all the animations in. So what I'm going to present to you is based on a recent study we published with four of us on the role of trust and trust building in transboundary waters. We did a literature review and an expert interviews and used conceptualizations from the field of international relations and natural resources management. In the orange box, there is a bit of a general conceptualization of the trust, but the main points, I guess, are that the conceptualizations that are existing in other fields emphasize that there are different ways of viewing trust from the rational, social, and psychological aspects, and considering also both existing and procedural trust, and then also noting that while trust is often seen to be between individuals, it can also exist between organizations or in terms of international relations, even between the state levels. Okay, next slide, please. For the sake of time, going straight to the 3 key points, the findings of our study. Well, obviously, it emerged that trust is considered very important, and it's needed to both initiate and maintain those water diplomacy activities between different parties and across levels. And obviously, it works also other way around. So once you establish those activities, they enhance trusting relations. So there is a kind of a positive vicious circle there at best. At the same time, none of the reviewed articles that were using trust and trust building as in examples that are needed in water diplomacy in shared waters didn't really define what they mean by it. So it was seen in variety of forms, and quite often it was particularly easy to recognize its importance when there was a lack of trust. So that's kind of how the importance of trust is particularly easy to recognize, obviously. Perhaps the main contribution of our article is that we then did a bit of a coding on all the different kind of trust building activities that the literature recognized and categorized them into these 10 categories. On the left-hand side, perhaps the more conventional and formal and rationally oriented activities related to shared data, joint rules and agreements, joint organizations and processes of water. And then on the right-hand side, more social and also informal relations related to more social interactions and others. What was interesting, of course, that there was also these broader issues related, for example, to collective identity and also conflict resolution emerging as its own kind of a field that was considered particularly important when there are tensions. So these 10 we established, and it was a wider variety than what we originally expected to kind of see from the literature. Next slide, please. And then what we ended up doing is to success the kind of a basics conceptualization for approaching trust in shared waters. This bit clumsy looking diagram tries to note that in a way you have these elements of rational and social trust across the scales or levels. There is the state, organizational, and personal level there, and behind it is the ultimately psychological aspect of trust. And then that there are these different activities that can help to enhance the trusting relations and the actual trust, both in terms of rational and social trust. What was also obviously clear is that trust is a process. So we also try to provide one basic visualization on trust if you click Tegan once. So seeing that how kind of trust changes over time and these different aspects of trust can be emphasized at different parts of the time. So this figure tries to kind of conceptually understand that. And what is of course interesting from here, and you can click the next slide for the conclusions, is about the enabling factors, something we talk about today's session, and what are the main challenges. So obviously in my presentation, the enabling factor is the trust. That's something that we need to pay attention to, and our argument in this study was that in a way it's easy to say that that's needed, but there are actually conceptualizations to understand what we first of all mean by it, and then related to that there are different ways we can build trusting relationship through these activities, and they kind of fall into different categories. And obviously challenges with trust is it's much easier to lose than build, and it links to broader geopolitical relations. Finland and Russia has well-established transboundary water cooperation that I have also been studying with my colleagues, but obviously with the current Ukrainian war, also those kind of relations have been quite strongly shaped in terms particularly of trusting relations, for example. But it's also interesting related to that to note then finally that you can actually have the trust on the process itself, on the procedure of bringing actors together, even if you would not necessarily have the trust between the actors directly. So that kind of emphasizes the long-term commitment for interaction, and it can be also potentially facilitated by a third-party actor, which is from the peace building perspective also interesting. But with that, I thank you for your attention.
And here, like this, wherever you're comfortable. Okay. So I'm going to, you can go to the next slides. I'm going to present you kind of continuation, next ones, yeah, of the research which we did together with Marko, which he just presented, and it's also part of my PhD, and we did it with the financial support of USIP. And the project is about testing the theory, how and why data sharing leads to trust building in transboundary water cooperation. And here, as you saw on Marko's slide, data sharing is considered as one of the activities which lead pretty straightforwardly to trust. And here there are some screenshots from articles, policy papers, which clearly state that once there is data sharing, it automatically leads to trust. And therefore, we wanted to kind of unpack and understand better what are the mechanisms which lead actually to trust in data sharing. Thank you. And for that, we specifically looked into 2 case studies. In depth, we looked into Sava River Basin in Southeastern Europe, in Balkans, and in Sirdarya River Basin in Central Asia. And what is interesting about these 2 basins is that they are post-Yugoslavian, post-USSR context, and in both basins, countries have people speak the same language, they have similar culture, traditions, and past history together. But at the same time, they are also quite contrasting cases, because in Sava River Basin, riparian countries experienced war between each other during Yugoslavian wars, which was happened not so long ago, like 30 years ago. But however, water was kind of entry point into environmental peace building, because Sava agreement on joint management of Sava River Basin was the first agreement after the war that countries came together. And since then, they are cooperating quite well, versus in Sirdarya River Basin, they didn't experience war, and on the political level, the relationships are quite good. But however, at the same time, they face a lot of challenges with their transboundary cooperation and data sharing also. Here we looked into specifically into sources of trust or regions of trust in data sharing under this conceptualization of rational, social, psychological trust, which Marko mentioned. And here we identified that there are quite a lot of different regions or sources how trust can be built through data sharing. And as a rational trust, for example, you can see that, for example, previous experience and history plays a role, official commitment, river basin organization. Under social trust is common social identity, kind of speaking the same language, or being hydrologists, or being environmentalists together. So this kind of aspects play a role. And in psychological trust, it's personalities, it's personality individuals who work for river basin organizations, or for example facilitators of negotiations. But what we identified, interestingly, that at the initial stage of cooperation in both basins, social and psychological trust played very important role. So it was important to bring countries, representatives of different countries together, that this kind of narrative of, okay, we are brothers, we are neighbors, we should care about the river and our people, played a strong role, versus later, as we saw during the process of cooperation, rational trust, having clear rules and regulations about how to share data, how to manage river, became much more important. And here in Sava River Basin case, I can see that we developed these stages, 5 different stages of trust, how it was developing throughout their cooperation, from the absence of trust, then it developed into emerging trust, initial trust, stabilizing trust, and resilient trust. And this happened through their activities in data sharing. So at the beginning, it was important that they have this social basis for trust, psychological trust. However, there should be something tangible. There should be activities based on which countries can develop this trust to each other. And here you can see that also at each of the stages of trust, there is a certain dynamic of trust inside. So it can still go up and down depending on the political relationship or some other events happening, maybe not related even to water. So it can kind of fluctuate, but however, it stays within a certain box, let's say. And here at this stage of resilient trust, there is a certain resilience built, which says that already there is this kind of trust, which doesn't fluctuate much, doesn't go down strongly, because there is already, trust is not dependent that much already on the political situation, that it built its resilience. However, in Sirdarya River Basin case, it's a bit, or very different. They didn't start from the stage of absence of trust, because the relationship between countries was good. They started from we argue that they started with the emerging trust stage, and somehow they couldn't further build trust because they don't share data. So there was not that much progress. And in that sense, they kind of still stay at this stage of emerging trust. And here it also goes up and down quite strongly. Then we also identified that it is quite important for trust and trust building. What are the forms of sharing data? So as we know, data sharing, as we can imagine, data sharing not only happens through official regulated channels and ways of sharing data, but it can be also, we call it informal or non-formalized practices of data sharing. So for example, in Sardaria Basin as well in Sava, also we could identify that sometimes people just call to their counterparts in another country asking for a certain data. And then for us, it was quite interesting, at least for me from the beginning, how this kind of personal relationship which are there, does it help actually to build or strengthen trust between countries? And then what we identified is that non-formalized practices of data sharing, it builds trust between individuals, so they might still have good relationship and rely on each other. But however, institutionalized forms of data sharing or formalized regulations, they help not only build trust between individuals, but they also build inter-organizational interstate trust. So it kind of helps to transform interpersonal into our inter-organizational and interstate trust. And some of the concluding thoughts, which I didn't mention before, that but Marko mentioned some of them also. Thanks for that. So trust has two roles. Trust is, when it comes to data sharing, trust can be considered as a product of data sharing. So you share data and with time you develop this trust. And also it can be enabling trust for data sharing at the beginning, but also for even more data sharing, because in both basins we could say, especially in Sava, that data sharing can become even richer, bigger, deeper. Then trust built through data sharing can also spill over to other activities in transboundary water cooperation. So you build trust through data sharing, and then it kind of helps or enables you to cooperate on something else, on some other activities. And this institutionalization of trust is quite important if you want to develop trust between countries, not only between individuals. And then compliance, time, and consistency are key for building institutionalized trust. And I stop here. Thanks a lot.
I think that I want to make sure that works. All right. Thank you. I want to take a chance to narrow the scope a little bit from our conversation. So broadly, we've been talking about larger trust in overarching cooperative processes, looking specifically at data sharing as well. And our particular focus for our paper, which was what I'll be talking about now, and then also what Alex will be talking about in the following presentation, was a joint project funded by USIP to look more specifically at conflict resolution mechanisms. So we'll be kind of narrowing down into that focus. So why do we want to actually look at dispute resolution mechanisms? So we know that there's going to be an potential risk for increasing conflict, uncertainty due to climate change and availability of water, economic growth, population growth, all of the above that we've been talking about. And broadly within the literature and within practice, it's widely agreed that dispute resolution mechanisms help to reduce conflict over transboundary waters. We see this in the use of various assessments, such as the TWAP analysis, and that done by De Stefano et al. In 2017. But there has been some studies that have also showed that other mechanisms might actually be more effective in resolving disputes than dispute resolution mechanisms themselves. So I've cited here one study by Mitchell and Sapari where they're saying enforcement mechanisms and information exchange might actually be more effective. But what we really have is a large gap in our understanding, because we're missing a systematic assessment of all the dispute resolution mechanisms within transboundary waters, and ultimately how to determine whether or not they are effective at the global scale. Most of the research is, there we go. And so we're looking at the kind of from the global scale. So we wanted to design a conceptual framework for looking at dispute resolution mechanisms and how to understand their effectiveness. So that's kind of the goal of the paper we're talking about today. So when we're talking about dispute resolution mechanisms, first we need to define a few terms. So dispute versus conflict, are they actually the same? So in our conceptual framework, we break these apart, where a dispute is a short-term specific issue that's often resolvable, and we've indicated this by a particular wave on this framework. The conflict then is a persistent disagreement that involves perceived incompatible interests or goals and is represented by the combination of multiple waves. So you might have an underlying conflict and a certain trigger will happen, and then you have a dispute, and that can change in various intensities or rates of change, and it can be kind of visually mapped using this wave system. These take place within the overarching pattern of interactions between the states over water and within the political, social, and economic context. So since they're different, do we actually try and solve them the same way? What we hypothesize and what we're looking for, and what we've seen in a lot of the data, is that dispute resolution mechanisms may tend to be more reactive rather than proactive in addressing conflict. So they're more addressing a dispute rather than addressing the underlying conflict from which a dispute might arise. So we need dispute resolution mechanisms in conjunction with other cooperative processes to help get at that underlying conflict. Our focus for this project, however, is on the dispute resolution mechanisms themselves, which we can separate into two different types. A de jure mechanism, where we're focusing on the prescribed course of actions that states take, codified within their treaty or formal legal arrangement, and then their de facto action. So what's the particular practice that they're doing, maybe without a legal arrangement in place, or that's completely different than what might be within that legal arrangement. So we've designed kind of an overarching flow chart for thinking about what are the different types of mechanisms we see within treaties. So we're just focusing on treaties to do the global scale analysis. That does limit our ability to look at de facto at a global scale. So this is mostly focusing on de jure as what's written and codified in these treaties. They're broken down into three main categories, political being the most common mechanism, with 39% of treaties overall that are on freshwater basins. And within that, unassisted mechanism, so no third party involvement in the process, is more common than assisted mechanisms where a third party is involved in a process. And then we have the most common being negotiation and then transferring the dispute to a commission at the political level. The next most common are judicial-based mechanisms, with arbitration being the dominant of the two between arbitration and adjudication. And then lastly is our technical mechanisms. Again, unassisted mechanisms are more common than third-party assisted mechanisms, and most commonly it's referral to a commission or some sort of technical expert group within a river basin organization. You'll notice this probably counters a lot of what's been said in the literature and practice with respect to the inclusion of third-party actors in solving disputes, as well as having more technical-based processes. So what we recommend and what we see in the treaties, it differs. It doesn't necessarily mean that's what states do in practice, it's just what they have in their treaties. So how do we know if they're effective? We define effectiveness relative to a particular dispute. So do actors continue to be in a state of dispute or in a state of conflict at the end of that process? Effective, yes or no? These are based on three different dimensions. The output of the process, so what's the formal award? What's the treaty that was the result? Is there just some sort of informal understanding that happened? What are the outcomes? So how did states' behavior change as a result of that process or as a result of that particular output? So looking at compliance, implementation of the particular outputs. And then lastly, is there any physical impact? So what changes happened as a result of that process? Biophysical changes, socio-political changes, all of the above. And so we're looking at that through this kind of widening scope of effectiveness, which is along a particular spectrum ranging from ineffective to effective. And then we kind of have this gray area in between where it's not effective, but it's not ineffective. And so we might see, so it's maybe mitigating the problem, or conditions are changing, but it's not really effective. We're maybe like putting a lid on it, but the water's still boiling in that pot. And these are based on the internal aspects of the process, so the design of the particular mechanism, as well as external aspects that are imposing factors upon the system. So how the history of interactions are, what's the political context, what's the history of relationships between the states, and so forth. So what did we find? we found that only 45% of treaties on freshwater transboundary rivers have a de jure mechanism embedded within the text of the agreements, and this is only within 58% of basins. So slightly over half of basins have a dispute resolution mechanism, which is kind of shocking. I think we would have expected maybe for that to be a little bit higher in terms of global spatial coverage. We also found that broadly, disputes are generally addressed at the political level rather than the technical level, which often counters some of the current literature. And often they are unassisted. So the states have more control of the particular process and the outcomes having an unassisted process. This is often contrary to a lot of our current discourse, which is including third-party stakeholders as either a facilitator or a mediator in that particular process. But it often asks states to give up a little bit of control in terms of what those outcomes might be. States' interests are also very broadly, and the outcomes of their dispute resolution are impacted very heavily by outside mechanisms and outside forces. And so we can see a few of these examples in one of the case studies we looked at, which was the construction of the Zaiburi Dam in Laos on the Mekong River Basin. And you can see the overarching range of the kind of intensity of the dispute by the wave, and then the different mechanisms that took place within the different categories. So judicial, political, and technical. So you get kind of the formality of actors along the y-axis, and then core actions that took place. So most of the decisions that were made were taken at the technical level, but they were heavily supported by processes at the technical that go into, or kind of supporting and providing more information to the political level. And then the last kind of section of key findings are that a lot of states do end up going into formal judicial mechanisms, primarily because they have kind of clearly defined procedures and often result in binding outcomes. And so we see this as an example that's been used multiple times in the Kishinganga case on the Indus River. And this is also where we find that clear dispute resolution processes are particularly crucial. Indus is an excellent example. We're currently having two parallel processes that might have completing legitimacy as a result of how that is designed and states' interpretation. So having this clear order of operations is going to be particularly important in a de jure mechanism. And then we often see that these dispute resolution mechanisms are reactive, as I talked about before. And then Alex will be talking a little bit more about our last finding with the scalar piece. So I won't go into detail with that. So thank you all. Sorry, I went over time a little bit. It's a lot of information I just threw at you, but happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you, Melissa, for the wonderful presentation. So I'm going to be talking today about a separate but related paper that takes a more multi-scalar approach to the study of dispute resolution processes in transboundary basins. So I apologize ahead of time if some of the stuff is a little repetitive, but I do think it's important to go over some of the same terms again, because we need to really clearly understand what they mean to understand the key findings of the paper. So as we all know, water governance is complex and it involves different issues and interests that cut across multiple geographical, governance, and temporal scales. Especially when it comes to transboundary waters, water is not going to be governed by a single entity that operates in a clearly defined geographical area. In all transboundary water basins, and indeed all watersheds, there are multiple actors that bring their own diverse interests to the table, including political, social, cultural, and economic considerations. Despite this multiplicity and diversity of actors who are actually involved in transboundary water management and governance, historically, the literature has focused on state-level governance at the basin level of analysis. However, embracing the complexity that's offered by transboundary water governance can help us move more effectively towards better solutions that are more durable and more effective and more equitable for all involved. With these considerations in mind, this special report is offering a new multi-scalar lens to give more nuanced consideration to the role of water across three different scales: spatial, temporal, and governance. And we apply it in 3 case studies: disputes in Lake Chad Basin, the Yarmouk, and the Aral Sea Basin. Before I go ahead, I just want to define some key terms because, like I said, it's very important to understand and unpack what these terms mean, because I'll be using them a lot. When I say problem space, I mean the interconnections between a water conflict, water disputes, water conflicts, and the broader political conflict that these two water conflicts and disputes are nested in. Similarly, the solution space refers to the interplay of methods for managing, resolving, or transforming these problems. We take scale to mean the organization of space according to physical or political demarcations. In our study, like I said, we use 3 scales: temporal, spatial, and governance. And within each scale, we have many different levels. For example, a governance scale, you can have governance at the local level, subnational level, and so on. And again, just to reiterate, a water dispute is a very narrow disagreement, typically over a specific issue, such as water allocation or the construction of particular infrastructure. And it's embedded within a broader water conflict, which is more systemic, long-lasting, and definitely more messy. And disputes and conflicts are, of course, embedded within broader political conflicts between the countries sharing water resources. In our study, we plotted the effectiveness of the dispute resolution processes on this scale that Melissa was talking about. And just to reiterate again, at their most effective, dispute resolution processes can have positive cascading effects on the broader conflict cooperation dynamics. And at their most ineffective, they can actually lead to an escalation of the broader conflict and have negative cascading impacts. So rather than go into detail about the methods that we did and take you through step by step, I just want to talk about some of the key takeaways that emerged from our findings. The first of those is that mapping the scales, levels, and issue scopes of the disputes and conflicts under study can help us define the problem space. And defining the problem space more robustly can help us foresee how potential solutions may exacerbate problems or how other solutions might be overlooked. So I'm going to use the example of the yarmulke here. This is the scalar mapping of the temporal, spatial, and governance scales in the dispute in question. And the dispute that we used in our analysis was a specific dispute between Israel and Jordan over water allocations from the Yarmuk River, which is a tributary to the Jordan. So spatially speaking, the blue dots are the problem space, and the open green circles represent the solution space to kind of show that the problem space is nested within the solution. So spatially speaking, the dispute here is, or the problem is taking place at the sub-basin level because the Yarmuk is a tributary river to a broader basin. But the resolution processes, the solution spaces have taken place both at the sub-basin, so involving just Israel and Jordan. And we've also had basin-wide processes as well. I'm speaking specifically about the Johnston Plan, which took place in the 1950s and was an attempt to come to a regional solution to water allocations from the Jordan River. Temporally speaking, the problem is both episodic and long-term in nature. So the Yarmuk River dispute I'm talking about happened over a period of about 15 years, from about 1979 up until the eve of the signing of the peace treaty in 1994. Disagreements typically flared up in the summertime when water levels were low. So it's episodic in nature, but it's also long-term because it happened over about 15 years. And at the governance scale, we had only Israeli and Jordanian water officials, technocrats involved in the dispute, and also they were heavily involved in the solution space. But we've also, it's international in scope, but we've also had, again, regional attempts to resolve the broader water conflict, for example, the Johnston Plan. A second key takeaway is that we can leverage scalar matches and mismatches to maximize solution spaces. I'm going to use Lake Chad as an example. So as we can see here, there's a lot more mismatch between the scales of the problem space and the scales of the solution space. We don't see a lot of green circles in the blue ones. Scalar mismatches in the Lake Chad between localized long-term water disputes and the implementation of these very short-term yet basin-wide or regionally focused solutions, primarily on defeating Boko Haram, a terrorist group operating in the basin, have prevented durable solutions from being reached. And And I do just want to preface that by saying that this isn't to say that scalar mismatches are always going to lead to ineffective solutions. It's just in this particular case, we see that the mismatch, for example, the lack of involvement of local people who were actually the ones involved in water disputes in the broader solutions led to negative cascading impacts. And the third key takeaway is that we really need to adopt pragmatic strategies to consider how more interests can meet more needs. The first caveat to that is that context really matters. Like I just said before, just because scalar mismatches in Lake Chad led to an ineffective solution doesn't mean that that's always going to be the case. Depending on the context, sometimes scalar mismatching can be good. So we don't mean to make any normative prescriptions with our framework or our findings, rather it's more of a way to describe these problem spaces and these solution spaces and their scalar interactions between the two. Central parties to the disputes have to be included in solutions, and crucial to that is that we need to recognize that lower levels of governance and non-state actors shape domestic water and political concerns. Also, solutions to transboundary water problems have to be crafted within the de facto political realities of the states and localities involved. Again, this is why context really matters. More is not necessarily always better. I'm going to use the example of the Yarmuk again. That dispute resolution process took place within a very tense, a time of tense political relations between Israel and Jordan. So publicizing that resolution process and involving more people, inviting more people to the table, likely would have led to an ineffective solution. However, just involving the process between Israeli and Jordanian water officials led to the building of trust, like Bota and Marko were talking about, that helps them sign the lead to the signing of the peace treaty. And lastly, I just want to end with a few future directions that we can take our research in and unanswered questions that need exploring. So first, we recognize that the generalizability of our results is very limited because we only apply this to 3 basins. So the framework needs to be applied to other basins and also disputes other resource types. How can we take a multi-scalar approach to, let's say, disputes over extractive minerals or forestry resources? Further exploration of the scalar dimensions of transboundary water governance and how this relates to effective dispute resolution is needed. Some questions coming off of that include, how can institutions operating at different spatial scales interact with one another in preventing, resolving, or mitigating conflicts? For example, how do river basin organizations, which operate at the basin level, interact with regional organizations like the EU or the Southern African Development Community in resolving water conflicts? What is the role of non-state actors in transboundary water governance, and how do they contribute to water conflict and resolution processes? And going along with that, how can we contend with non-state armed groups and illicit actors who are involved in water conflicts? I'm specifically thinking of examples like Boko Haram or ISIS, who have played a key role in the provision of basic services such as water, further adding to the complexity in transboundary water conflicts. Thank you.
All right, so switching gears a little bit, I'm going to be talking about how to track progress in track 1.5 and 2 water dialogues. This is building on work of my former team, the Learning Evaluation and Research team at USIP. And so, as many of you likely know, track 1.5 and track 2 dialogues are often used, along with track 1 and 3, to bring people together across the lines of division to either understand the conflict a little bit better from the other's point of view, or directly start problem solving towards the challenges that the conflict is about. From a monitoring, evaluation, and other project design perspective, there's many difficulties in gauging the impacts related to these dialogues. As they mentioned trust so many times, we can confirm that change often moves at the speed of trust, which is very difficult to build and very easy to break. And measuring those changes over time is often the linchpin of whether or not a dialogue yields results in the long term. And one of the other many challenges, rather, that we found particularly important is that there is often an over-reliance on self-reported data. If a dialogue is monitored at all, that is, it is usually done by self-reported information like pre and post surveys from the dialogue participants, or relying on the facilitator and convening party themselves, who are very biased towards the outcomes that they produced within their dialogue. And this does not lead to very systematic monitoring over time. And especially, I'm not sure how much overturn happens in your organization, but dialogue processes often have multiple facilitators over time trying to help the process move along. And so being more systematic about these changes can yield to us better understanding our outcomes and how those outcomes were produced. And so the Learning, Evaluation, and Research team has been developing a monitoring dialogue framework and tool in collaboration with many scholars and evaluators and practitioners in dialogues all over the world. So this is definitely not just my own or my own former team's work. I'm going to skip the criteria other than to say that one of the key goals in this was to make sure that anything we produced for monitoring these dialogues would be useful to the dialogue itself, not just useful for funding purposes and telling the story and down the road, but useful for the decision-making processes of the facilitating team and participants. But first, why does this matter to all of you at this conference? As you may have experienced in your work or in your literature, even the most legally perfect, technically sound solution can often fail because of political, social, and other intangible dynamics happening in the conflict. And so getting more astute about measuring those dynamics is one of the gaps that we hope to fill with this. And so I'm going to zoom through these next several slides. Bear with me. I'm hopeful at the end of this process, you'll understand the framework and tool quite intuitively, but I'm going to zoom through. So there's 3 different levels and 3 different dimensions. The levels are the direct, and so that is measuring what happens within the dialogue itself or within the dialogue participants. The meso is what happens on within the sphere of influence of the dialogue participants. And so on a track 1.5, that still may be a broad sphere of influence, but it's still related directly to the dialogue participants. And the macro is the relatively more intuitive socio-political and institutional changes in society. The dimensions are part cognitive, so the analytic skills and perceptions of participants or of society, and the behavioral relational is more of the interpersonal relations and communication norms. And then the transfer contribution claims, which they're probably going to change that title, but that is essentially looking at how do we capture how changes that happened at the direct level had any link to changes that happened on the meso and macro. Because in the meso and macro, those are context monitoring components. You're only going to be contributing to that along with multiple other organizations or initiatives or the conflict itself. And so how do you measure in a process tracing kind of dynamic the link between what you did at the dialogue and the changes on those broader levels? And so any given dialogue process may only use, well, obviously only the direct part of the dialogue. If the conflict is very intense, you may not be even hoping for changes at the meso or macro level, but you would always measure at least some degree of changes at the direct level, hopefully. And then whatever your goal is, you would pick and choose the different changes that you're looking to monitor across that. So related to water, on the cognitive level, some of these may relate the direct level to better understanding the transboundary water issues from the other party's perspective. It may involve identifying equitable solutions together. On the meso level, it may involve like a broader, better awareness for what the shared challenges are and some of the dependencies that they have with one another. And changes on the widespread macro level may have to do with the zero-sum thinking about water resources versus more kind of not perceiving that there is a threat anymore with benefit sharing and the other party benefiting as well. On the relational level, The changes in the direct level may have to do with expressing empathy towards one another. May have to do with the frequency of positive interactions and like respectful communication styles. And on the inter-community level, that may be the intergroup tension over the water allocation schedule, or maybe starting to adopt terminology that was traditionally, historically, only the other side's terms or methods. And then on the macro level, that would be changes in policy, changes in norms, or changes in like widespread media. And apologies that somehow my arrows got messed up a little bit. And then moving on to the tool, the team is currently converting that framework into essentially a clearly codified Likert scale that is used for measuring demonstrable change. So not just self-reported, but things that you would actually see or observe the other party saying or doing. And so across this scale, any given dialogue may have multiple stages of this scale manifesting at any given time. And likewise, as we all know, conflict often digresses. And so any given dialogue process may veer one way or both ways over the course of time. But we are looking to better measure how those changes happen over time. And so again, with scholars and practitioners, we have been identifying the catalytic kinds of changes that we can get more clear measurements for. And so one of these is the prevalence of intergroup tension. This is something that I'm sure all of you can think of the last time that somebody said something and the whole room tensed up, but thinking of ways that you can share that measurement experience and not just feel it in your own heartbeat without putting like heart monitors on all of your dialogue participants. We have been looking for ways that would manifest within the group. And so for instance, on the adversarial side, that may mean that there is frequent disputes and confrontations between members of both groups. And even for relatively low stakes, non-sensitive kinds of interactions, they're very tense and very posturing and aggressive. If it becomes a more moderate engagement, that it would be more of a mixed interaction, again, relating to intergroup tension, where disputes over low stakes kinds of situations are relatively peaceful. There's mutual respect, there's positive dialogue, positive communication terms and whatnot. But for any high stakes or highly sensitive, that is when more posturing and more accusations or aggressive kinds of behavior starts to come out between groups. On the way to the cohesive side, that is when you have more respectful communication. The tension is relatively low, even for very high stakes, because they are working on problem solving, even on those very highly sensitive kinds of environments. And so we are looking for all kinds of different measures of trust and empathy and other like leading indicators that we have identified, finding ways to measure that across scales, and again, in observable, demonstratable ways. And so to recap, this is one of, I hope, many evidence-based ways to more systematically observe these intangible yet critical processes in track 1.5 and 2 dialogues. But we are always interested in other ways to monitor and research these intangible pieces. And this method and tool is meant to be a systematic monitoring system to help with decision making. But we are interested in others' perspective as well. What are leading indicators for progress, as well as leading indicators for failure? And in particular, how can we better identify spoilers as they may arise? Thank you.
Could I invite all the speakers up to the front? And Marko, would you be willing to go back on the screen? This is the time for discussion, and we really want to hear from all of you what you'd like to talk about and what is your experience in thinking through some of these issues on your own. If it's okay, I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to ask a couple of questions